Yes, hello, good evening. Thank you for coming. I'm glad that you came. I know you have a choice and that you chose to come here. So I hope that I make it worthwhile for you. Okay. So we'll start right out on it. We're going to basically cover definitions and a lot of background material first. So we'll get into the individual capitalisms later. And this is a general preview for tonight. Okay. So, defining capitalism. So, one system, many models. Capitalism has many varieties. It's definitely not one size fits all, and it is continually evolving through various historical stages, always in flux. You know, they call it chaotic capitalism. That's the Swedes like to refer to America's capitalism as chaotic capitalism. So, similar principles, varied characteristics. Certain principles define capitalist economic system. Each model follows, such as number one, maintaining a market-based economy, and number two, private ownership of the means of production, distribution, and pricing. And number three here again, beyond those principles, each model is defined by distinctive characteristics. They can be national, historical, cultural, institutional factors, any shapes and definitions, whatever, for each model. That's what really shapes and defines the model. So key indicators in areas of convergence. There are certain areas where all the models converge and they have a certain characteristic in common. So in spite of different methods, these forms converge, sharing variations of the same key indicators in each model. And there's three places: the production organization at the company level, the state role in each model, and the institutions and basic values unique to the natural culture. All of those play an important part on how the capitalism manifests itself and folds out. Okay, so capitalism and democracy. So capitalism is an economic system.
Michael, the slides are not moving.
Because I'm not moving them. Okay. Okay. So let me do this here. So I want to use the directional arrows. Shall I just put continue here? The meeting is being recorded. I mean, I have a drop down here that says continue. Is that how I started in or what?
You could just click it. It should go.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm not getting, okay, that's how. So this is a brief description, but let's move on from that now. So here we go, defining the models. One system, many models. We took care of that already. Okay, so now, see, Ibrahim, can you back me up? I have to do this. Okay, so capitalism and democracy, what's their relationship? Capitalist society used free market mechanisms to achieve high standards of living, and it uses democracy to keep a laissez-faire active, and monopoly under control. So there is a recurrent theme there with each. Free market mechanisms basically allow for regular flow of goods and services, and the pace of change quickens and always reshapes with introduction of new technology. That always happens. So capitalist societies are all very well known for their high standards of living in developed economies. Many in the West tend to use capitalism in their political system, where capitalism is widespread. But it's really an economic system. But capitalism does not limit itself to any particular political system. You look what happened in China. They embraced capitalism. Who would have thought that would have ever happened? But it does. Democracy works as a good system to ensure competition is maintained on a healthy level. And the importance of market mechanisms, the free market mechanism, which means that play between stock and demand, supply and demand. That's the mechanism. It allows for the regular flow of goods and services. Economic and political decisions accommodate those who control assets and leadership. The pace of change quickens and shapes with introduction of new technologies. Innovation and entrepreneurship are major drivers of the market. And we'll hear about this later. And near the end, we'll have a bunch of slides on Schumpeter, the economist. Very interesting character. So the great shift, the free market took over once economic surplus was no longer taken by force in feudalism. So surplus appropriation by the market economy allowed for social systems and market-based economics. So capitalism formed a middle class and universal suffrage grew when the rulers saw that voters wouldn't elect revolutionary political leaders. Democratic principles grew, and so did bureaucracy. Now, here's a quote. I'm going to introduce these quotes from along the presentation from Schumpeter. He was the Austrian economist, really unusual character, and you'll learn about it too near the end. So basically, here's the one quote. Bureaucracy is not an obstacle to democracy, but an inevitable complement to it. And he says, democracy is a political method, that is to say, a certain type of institutional arrangement for arriving at political, legislative, administrative decisions, and hence incapable of being an end in itself. It's not just enough to be a democracy. You have to be more than that. So different forms, different solutions. Capitalism, the modern market-driven economic system, is only around 300 years old, but as a social economic system, it's still very much a work in progress. Despite its economic dominance, many question if it's a beneficial way to organize society. This was more obvious after the 2008 crisis, with its effect on global economies. This global system, using the dollar as the world's reserve currency, suddenly became questionable. And the future indicates more stress is forthcoming to society and social organization as disruptive technologies bring changes, leaving huge segments of society behind if unable to adapt at a faster pace than ever before. More centralization, artificial intelligence, and a fourth industrial revolution expect to benefit many, yet will also fragment society for those unwilling or unable to adapt. And there's some of that play going on now, as you might have noticed. So viewing variations is instructive as each adapts to solving similar challenges differently. So as such, capitalism continually evolves many variations of the same economic system. So we all too often have socialism for the rich and rugged free capitalism for the poor. That's a quote from Martin Luther King. It's on the bottom of the screen there on the left-hand side. And then on the right, of course, someone that's waiting for the trickle down that doesn't seem to come yet. Okay. So Adam Smith. So in general, distinguish. We need when you look at the history of capitalism, you really have to be sure what you're looking at, the context, the contradiction, invalid timelines, things like that. So distinguish between the ideal and the real, and beware of misleading rhetoric. In historical development of capitalism, timelines are often made up to suit a narrative. So Oxford English Dictionary, for instance, traces the first use of the word capitalism to an 1854 Thackeray novel, The Newcomes. Now, Adam Smith only lived until 1790. So chances are he was not acquainted with the word capitalism under that name. What he did is he called it simple economic individualism. So let me see. Smith called economic individualism a simple system of natural liberty in the wealth of nations. So most writings on capitalism were by socialists in opposition to it. That was ironic. They lacked a name for the economic system. So Karl Marx followers, they invented the word capitalism. Not until the 20th century was the word and concept promoted by the Austrian school economists, Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, and by Milton Friedman as well. He was 1976 American Nobel Prize winning economist to back up their work on capitalism. Basically, in theory, In theory of moral settlements, Smith explained the principles of economic individualism, and he extended his discussion on it into the wealth of nations. Smith was no economist, but his writings on division of labor, free trade, self-interest in exchange, price and market structure, and limits of government intervention came when economics was transitioning to modern. So he was labeled as an economist then, because he had some very good ideas for other economists. So Smith was a philosopher seeking to link political, social, economic thought as a way to order society. His philosopher's viewpoint was critical of merchants, manufacturers, and all deviations of commercial society. Since mercantilism, the dominant economic system of his time, used monopoly and price manipulation for personal gain. Now, how a philosopher's vision of a simple system of natural liberty, known as economic individualism, turns into a capitalism focused only on profit spreads for individual enrichment as a sole goal, is a thought worth pondering. So let's read one of Smith's philosopher quotes to see what he says. He basically was a moral philosopher. So you'll notice in the yellow square there, I don't know if I can move it around to read it a little more here, but here, I'll read it to you. So his philosopher's viewpoint was critical to merchants and manufacturers and all deviations of commercial society since mercantilism, etc. Okay, let's read that one. Note on the yellow square of the quote, it's a very small print. The oppression of the poor must establish the monopoly of the rich. Profit or income equality are always highest in the countries which are going fastest to ruin. Adam Smith. And then he says as well, there on the bottom left, you see, individual ambition serves the common good, yet greed causes poverty and economic instability as well. So that's your introduction to Adam Smith, but let's talk about the other thing that he's best known for. The invisible hand. So the invisible hand went from metaphor to myth. The invisible hand misconstrued endured as a persistent myth. So it became economic theory and further validation against regulatory controls of any kind. The metaphor's real meaning had nothing to do with markets being inherently stabilizing. And that's what everyone tried to link it to. That was around the turn of the century in the 1900s, or in the 20th century rather. They were trying to link it to a perfect system of competition, markets, and information. And this construct, it may be appealing, with appealing metaphor, it took on a life of its own to praise inaction as a laissez-faire model. But that was the invisible hand. You couldn't see it. So Schumpeter gives his opposing view on the perfect competition and more. 150 years later, in two quotes, he says, in economic life, competition is never lacking, but hardly ever is it perfect. And furthermore, the first thing a man will do for his ideals is lie. So of course, everybody was trying to skew the data and the research to their point of view, so they could get credit for a new theory. So the metaphor reappears in the 1930s and 40s. It's reinvented to prop up mathematical treatments of capitalism from Samuelson and Friedman in support of innovative analysis by association of the metaphor with a spontaneous order concept from Hayek. So it further greenlighted continued lack of scrutiny by policymakers educated to believe it was sound economic theory. Now, one economist knew from the beginning, that's Hyman Minsky, who said stability is destabilizing and the internal dynamics of modern economy are not equilibrium seeking. And then also in Smith's writing, he related it to national GOP. There was what it was one time, a merchant was feeling insecurity in sending capital abroad. He relented to invest domestically instead. That's the essence of the metaphor, nothing more. The unintentional consequence of local investment led to increases in domestic industry and employment, which were not his original consideration or intention. The outcome, however, served to bring subsistence and a small measure of prosperity to the local domestic community. None of it had anything to do with equilibrium. So Stiglitz himself also has a lot to say about this, and he had a Nobel Prize for this with 2 assistants as well. And he says, it provided arguments that politicians and people in the industry used for stripping regulation away. The argument was a variant of Adam Smith. Unfettered markets always lead to efficient outcomes. So that was basically what the invisible hand was supposed to represent. So even Alan Greenspan said, there's no such thing as a bubble, just a little froth in the economy. So Greenspan's reaction justified those who did not want to engage in regulation. So you both stripped it away and you appointed people who did not believe in regulation so they could feel good because they were doing what economic theory said you ought to be doing. So the real reason it's invisible is because it was never there. So Ibrahim, is there any way to get this full screen of some of the shots and get these the menu bar on the way out of not blocking this? Let me see here. I'll do that. All right.
I don't know. The slides are coming nicely though.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So anyways, so capitalism is characterized by 6 different things here. Free market system with private control of production, distribution, and price. Number 2, private ownership of wealth, assets, and business. Number 3, role of government intervention in the economy varies depending on the national model. Number 4, innovation and technology provide incentive of breakthrough to propel capitalism forward. So attraction of wealth generation acts as a spur to innovation. Access to credit favors capital accumulation. So this also plays a role in the inequality issue. So another quote from Schumpeter, there exists no more democratic institution than the market. So the best way to practice democracy is to be in the free market, because everybody's voting with their money. Whatever they decide to spend money on is what ends up becoming needed because it sells out. Okay, so features of the capitalist economic system: economic freedom. People can choose to control their economic destiny and even be wealthy. That's the ideal. Individual ambition serves the common good. That, as we just read that quote. So both points and Smith's quote personify his vision of economic individual, and that's the ideal. Consumer sovereignty, goods and services decided by consumer spending. That's the ideal. Limited government, rule of law is essential to capitalism, protects private property, provides security and court system to resolve disagreement, which relieves the state of any role to interfere or regulation. That is supposed to be the ideal. So the financial sector, banks capitalize firms and service households. That's the ideal. Banks desert the economy and resort to financialism. Worst case scenario. We've sort of gone through that. So number 4, financial sector, that I said that already. Number 5, the profit motive selects for efficient resource distribution, innovation, creativity, and dynamic markets. That's the ideal. Profit motive driven by short-termism is not good for the economy. That's the real. Although some people say that's the best because it puts the rent, it puts the profit in more people's hands. So market forces determine supply and demand dynamics. Pricing influences product allocation. If demand rises, firms are incentivized to increase supply. Flexible labor markets, that means it's easy to hire and fire. Free trade, no restraints or barriers to trade, to world trade, such as tariffs or high taxes. That's the ideal. So main purpose, capitalism's primary goal is the accumulation of profit. All else is secondary. That's real. So Milton Friedman, by the way, from his book in 1962, Capitalism and Freedom. He saw capitalism's social responsibility from a market-centric point of view, and he set the tone for the next couple of decades. He said there's only one social responsibility of business: to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase profits, so long as it stays within the rules of the game, which to say engages in open and free competition without deception or fraud. And there are economies with government spending reaching 35 to 50% of GDP. Such governments pay for welfare, health, education, national defense, but they are still viewed as capitalist since their private enterprise system is market driven. So that would be the Nordic countries I'm talking about there. Okay, success and failures. So, huge wealth generation, dynamic capital markets, and poverty alleviation. Capitalism is responsible for an incredible amount of wealth generation in the world. No other system showed so much innovation, creativity, and productivity with a long record of success. No other economic system lifted so many people out of poverty while creating dynamic global capital markets, increased global financial assets to near 194 trillion, which was shortly before 2008 when the crash happened. Okay, so history of contradictions, prone to habitual boom and bust. No other system caused such spectacular failures as the Great Depression and the 2008 financial crisis, where declines in equity and real estate values wiped out $28.8 trillion of global wealth in 2008 and the first half of 2009. Quite a record. And then Schumpeter's kind of lighthearted about this. He says, gentlemen, a depression is for capitalism like a good cold douche. That's the European word for shower. So capitalism thrives on volatility. The need for volatility leaves it prone to cyclical boom and bust. Wide spreads and greater risk are embraced to eventuate greater gains. When this scenario causes great losses, it brings prolonged depressions and austerity. That's when financial institutions and banks petition the state for bailout funds. Pre-crisis, these same companies spent millions lobbying against all forms of state interference. When crisis hits, they embrace the intervention with bailout funding. And it wasn't just the US that did that. Other countries in Europe, everyone did that. They all went running for a handout, which was needed. Okay, so another success and failure slide here. Right. Okay, so the 2008 profits were privatized and losses were socialized when the banker bets went bad. The price exacted from long economic contractions and recovery transition periods are paid by the public. Their sacrifice suffers the mistakes and bad judgment of irresponsible leadership. Trickle-down blowback from bad times is an economic reality instead of trickle-down from good times when large surpluses are captured by small percentages of the wealthy. So let's look at that chart on the bottom left there. And what it's showing is near 1970 side, these three factors were more or less in balance. So the red, for the green line, you have productivity. And for the red line, you have average income for the 1%. And then the blue line is average overall wages from 1979. Related growth patterns changed, okay? So productivity surged, the green, right? That's the green line, that surged. While income and wages, blue, stagnated for most Americans in medium household, and it kept pace with the economy since 1970. It would have reached, if it actually kept pace with it, it would have reached 92,000 by that time, not 50,000 where it stood when 2008 hit. So observe the different percentage increases in growth rate between all three. The red line on that line, that's 240%, pretty big increase. So that's in capturing the rent. So the green line, the actual increase in productivity itself, 40%. The blue line increased 5 to 10%. And that was the pay scale for most of the blue collar laborers. So, and then here we have all these businessmen waiting here to go to the corporate welfare office. And it says down below, it says, yeah, this is just temporary. The free market works best when there's no government intervention. Get in line, buddy. So here's some of those large dynamic markets. So in the US, capitalism's world leader, the two largest capital markets are the New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ, which are each way ahead of third place Japan. Even though Japan is fairly large, you see it there, right against the screen there where it says Henry George. So 93%, the New York Stock Exchange itself is bigger than the world's 50 smallest exchanges. So 50 of the smallest exchanges could all fit into that big green hexagonal form. So 93% of the world markets are on 3 continents: North America, 40.5%, Europe, 19.5%, and Asia, 33.3%. So 60 major capital markets, they make up $69 trillion. 16 exchanges, I think those are all these 16 we see here. And they're all in the 1 trillion club. They comprise 87% of the global market capitalization. The top 5 make up slightly more than half the world total. So, and then guess what? Now, only China comes close to America's claims, even surpassing some of them, believe it or not. You know, after China became the second largest economy after 4 decades in a spectacular transformation of the communist country, harnessing capitalism's benefits for its citizens while retaining its one-party political system. Sounds unbelievable, but it's true. It went from 80% agrarian to 60% urban, taking 800 million people out of poverty, according to World Bank 2019 figures. After decades-long double-digit growth figures, China's economy slowed down, but it still has around 6% annual GDP growth, higher than all others right around these days. And it accounts for over 28% of the world's economy. In 2019, China became the world's largest exporter and importer. So China needs the world and the world needs China. They are locked in a codependent relationship. China's CCP, central planning, has no intention of pursuing the West boom and bust scenario. All eyes are on China, however, to see what's next, what they do. Here again, there's a story of 2 different benchmark dates. Sometimes they use the time when Mao took over as a benchmark, 1949. Other times it starts at 1978 when their first system of reforms began. But you won't hear anyone talking bad about Mao in China because he was a hero to all of them still. Because he got all the foreigners out of the country and made China great again. So here's another statistic let's go to the bottom right-hand side here. So time frame, 1961 to 1968. So that was like mid-range from when Mao took over to the right before he passed away and they went into the reforms. So average year world GDP growth share, 1.1%. Global ranking, there's a line there. They're not ranking it yet. So the next one, these were after the reforms and the first batch of the reforms. Look at the growth share, 15.9%. Boy, do they know how to do capitalism. And in fact, this on the bottom right-hand side, that's a copy of one of the books one of the Chinese scholars wrote, Capitalism with Chinese Characteristics. So 2013 to 2018, full swing globalism, 28.1%. Their global ranking was first. So these are from National Bureau of Statistics, August 29, 2019, China. So they did quite a good job of capitalism for someone that was communist for a few decades. Makes you wonder if they had to become communist to become capitalist. You know, everything had to be destroyed and rebuilt up again. So let's look at the next slide on this same topic. So this is about Dambisa Moyo and TED Talks. And she explains here that 10% of the world backs Western neoliberal democracy and capitalism. 90% of the world is fixated on securing daily expenses just to stay alive. Chinese state capitalism captured 90% of the world's imagination that seek economic growth as a priority for their future success. And that it was proof positive that the experiment with China did with capitalism, that if anything produces better standards of living, it's capitalism. So capitalism is hard to beat. It's hard to beat that. Okay, so China's share of the world GDP, I read that already. Okay, so let's look down on the bottom here. And then you see, again, there's that 90 to 10% dichotomy on the top, and then along the bottom, the gray color is like they back private capitalism. So 10% of the world, it's not that much. But here, and the other one, they back state capitalism, de-emphasize democracy, and prioritize economic rights. So these poor people that have lived in poverty for decades, they're more interested in getting economic rights before political rights. Can you blame them? Okay, so here's some of the ups and downs of capitalism. Just you can do a quick look at them and you see, and basically they go anywhere from 15 to 18 years apart. You know, you have Black Monday, World War II, the dot-com boom, 73 oil crisis. This goes back about 90 years or more. Subprime mortgage crisis, that was a big one. And then a second hit on that. And then the Great Depression, no one to beat that. Okay, so let's move on to that. And I'm going to go past the next one as well here. I won't get caught up in these statistics. Okay, so there's such a thing called the Social Progress Imperative 2020. And it's Social Progress Index that scores 3 major indexes: basic human needs, foundations of well-being, and opportunity. And human needs, you have nutrition, medical care, sanitation, shelter, personal safety, and whatever else is blocked out there. Let me see if I can find it. Water, oh, of course, water. Foundations of well-being, education, information, communications, technology, health, wellness, environment. Opportunity, personal rights, freedom, choice, inclusiveness, access to advanced education. So all those things in a measurement. And so let's see how they did. And then here we are, somebody with the vacuum here. We're hoping that they can clean up America's social economic issues. Let's see if we can do better on that. Because right now, here's how we did on that. You see, the only one that regressed in social issues was America, the United States. We were too busy being capitalists. So US was the only G7 member to regress 2011, 2020 in social improvements. And then it says out of here, again, that statistic I read earlier, about 7 out of every 10 people prioritize health and well-being over GDP during coronavirus. And on the bottom, it's closer here, 47 to 53 on that. It's a bit closer. And it's all related to the social progress imperative of 2020. And then let me read you some more here about Dambisa. Actually, I did already, and 90%, right. Okay, so here's another social progress indicator. And here you see the US here is 28th. Now, when I did this talk about 3 years ago, The US was 19. Now they're down to 28. So they're losing ground. And amongst all the nations, why are some countries much better at turning their economic growth into social progress than others? How can the US be so far behind them? So that's an open-ended question. Okay, so here we have these little dots, and these are basically where people score on that index. United States not doing too bad. I mean, they're 28, but look where they are along this line. They seem to be doing better here for some reason. So let's do this. This is a quote from Joseph Schumpeter. And what he's talking about here is that mixed economies, pragmatism over ideology, listening helps. And in fact, a large percentage of the social market economies are they're mixed economies. You know, they're pragmatic. They want it to work. They're not so ideological. So here, the spirit of a people, its cultural level, social structure, the deeds, its policies may prefer. I want to go back. Sorry. Right. Try it again. So the deeds its policies may prepare. All this and more is written in its fiscal history, stripped of all phrases. He who knows how to listen to its message here discerns the thunder of world history more clearly than anyone else. So GDP is not destiny. So you see there's a lot of people grouped along the line there, and then there's ones further out. Luxembourg's way ahead of the curve. So you can see. All right. So the US economy is basically a FIRE economy. The FIRE stands for finance, insurance, and real estate. And that you look at this chart and you match that against manufacturing, and you will see that they correspond. The dark line goes down 11.2% down since 2009. But the red one here, finance, insurance, real estate, rental, and leasing, has gone up 21.5% since 2009. So, and that's going to be a GDP statistic. But, you know, so you see 11 and 2 in the other one. But look at the decline in manufacturing, and you see that all the way to 2009, and it started at 1947. So you know, in the U.S. here, let me read this here. So the U.S. keeps losing ground each year. Like I said, they were 19th last time, now they're 28th. And it doesn't work to extend U.S. capitalism beyond its own limits as an economic system and employ it as a socio-economic system beyond its profit-driven impulse. So Americans, they say Sweden is socialist. They can't see it as responsible capitalism with its big welfare safety net. With all those taxes, they think it's okay. But lots of Americans that live over there, they love that safety net. It makes life, that's a number of different things less that they have to worry about all day long that are taken care of for them. So in US capitalism, government, the political branch, is captive to the economic, which is big business. So that's crony capitalism. Now, if economic concerns dictate public policies and the politicians are owned by business, socioeconomics is an afterthought to economics when putting the government in service to business. Now, there is a danger to this, unfortunately, which is as firms, market powers rise, the more ability and need the firms have to gain political power. As such, market concentration can easily lead to a vicious cycle that ensues once businesses use money to get political power, then use political power to get money. Okay, so So here's an example of 3 different forms of capitalism, and these are more or less related to the UK. And let's just go over them kind of quickly here. And then I'll backtrack, actually. Some finance. So anyways, the capitalist economic system is dominated by free markets and private ownership. So many forms exist from unregulated turbo capitalism. That's there on the left-hand side, the unregulated form, which is responsible or social welfare capitalism. What you would have here on the bottom right there, you see, which is more or less an example of the German and the Nordic model. So turbo capitalism, it was basically tailor-made for the deregulation of Margaret Thatcher's rule in the 1980s. She was around the same time as Ronald Reagan, when there was all kinds of deregulation were let loose. Okay, so the absence of regulation for banking finance system encouraged banks to take risk and pursue profit through complex financial derivatives, the same thing that was going on here, rather than basic principles of attracting deposits and lending. So less regulation opened the doors for more abuse of monopoly power. So lower income tax and lower capital gains tax gave greater awards to high income earners. Unregulated labor markets made it easy to hire and fire workers. Working conditions were also deregulated. The 1980s financial deregulation, privatization, tax cuts for the wealthy, it was the norm. As such, rising income inequality partnered with financial deregulation played a key role in the unsustainable credit bubble of 2001 to 7. It also refers to an unrestrained capital or free market capitalism. Okay, so let's talk about the next one, crony capitalism. The next one down from turbo to crony. So crony, it's when business success depends on strategic influence of civil servants, politicians, and authorities. And it took place in the early 20th century when US business leaders paid off politicians in return for favors. Here in New York, Tammany Hall was famous for that too. So the degree of crony capitalism occurs in Asia and Latin American countries also, and we are told to a lesser degree in the US. Italy's mafia is a good example of crony capitalism. So advanced capitalism. It refers to societies where capitalism is firmly established with widespread acceptance of status quo. Advanced capitalism, consumerism is important. It tends to have an established welfare state to overcome the worst of the excesses in capitalism. So now we're up to responsible capitalism again. It has a free market economy using government regulation to avoid excesses of inequalities of capitalism, and also a progressive tax system where high earners contributing a higher percent for government spending. Most industries are in the private sector, but government often takes responsibility for areas with substantial positive externalities and social benefits like healthcare, education, public transportation, regulation, against monopolies are enforced, and workers' rights are also protected. So the responsible one, the Germans and the Nordics, supposedly. So state capitalism here, the Chinese model. So state-owned businesses, state-owned industries play a role within a market economy. Government has a key role in planning and controlling investment decisions in transportation and communication. China is the new state capitalism known as capitalism with Chinese characteristics. Private firms figure into the economy, but government plays the decisive role in energy, transportation, monetary, and exchange rate policy. The difference between state capitalism and state socialism is state socialism does not allow for private enterprise or competition, which state capitalism does. So now, there's 2 types of of liberal market economics. And there are liberal market economies, and those are basically, they're called LMEs. And they are, the UK, the English-speaking countries, Ireland, Australia, New Zealand, and such. And then also the coordinated market economies. They believe in strategic interaction between firms. That includes trade unions, suppliers of finance, and other actors involved with businesses. Includes Nordic, Baltic, Benelux, German, Japan, South Korea, other European countries. So, and this was all a big study that was done by two authors. And they wrote this book down here in the corner, Varieties of Capitalism. So what's interesting to note is that the observation, you look at this line here, and you can see that the liberal market economies are all here on the bottom left side. And they do the best here, like hiring and firing quick and not training people. And then the other ones, the coordinated ones, they're up here bunched together. And they do things together. They coordinate their economies together. So those are the two versions. Most of that is like that in Europe. Most of that's taking place in Europe. So you see, in other words, LME and the CME groupings are at opposite ends of the graph line. So this here is corporate governance, right? So they're high in corporate governance up here. And they're low, the US and the liberal market ones, they are low in corporate governments. It's everyone out for themselves. So US and Germany, two of the largest Western economies, are at opposite extreme ends. US is at the very bottom here, and DEU, Deutschland, is at the very top on the opposite end. And then Australia and Switzerland occupy the middle. That would be the Swiss and the Australians, not taking sides. So Nordic, Benelux, and Iberian countries form the other close groupings, except for Norway. Norway is way out here. And the reason is this axis has to do with labor. And then, of course, Norway is very labor prone. They protect their labor. They buy seats into the boards of companies just to see what they're doing, so they don't pull anything fast on them. Because they can do that. All that Black Sea oil, they have that in a sovereign wealth fund. So every year they take like 4% out of that, out of the earnings of it, not just out of the total, out of the earnings of the year. And they use that to run the country. We should be so lucky, huh? Okay, so mixed economies. This is the new old solution. So public, private, and traditional economies are combined as one. They express free market values and qualities of capitalism, while government controls state monopolies and prices of vital resources. Now, with mixed economies, there's three criteria: protecting private property, using supply and demand to set pricing, and three, driven by an individual self-interest and a profit motive. And they form together market, command, and traditional economies as one. The government controls the military, international trade, national transportation, state monopolies, vital resources, pricing, and distributes social services and benefits to the population. Now, advantages are in avoiding the failings of capitalism and socialist models. So mixed economies arose as a third option and a new normal in post-World War II, and are now more common than ever due to globalization. So China embraced capitalism mainly to experience economic growth and be tied to the world monetary system for trade purposes with the world. So globalization eventually fortified this marriage of opposites with trade. And although there are many, there are also some disadvantages to mixed economies. For instance, central planning of government industries can also create problems. If government industry, for example, the Defense Department, becomes a government subsidized monopoly or oligarchy system, it can lead to increasing national debt, slowing down economic growth in the long run. Powerful business sectors can lobby the government for more tax breaks while they park their money offshore. The government could protect free markets by not regulating enough and not enforcing existing regulations. So they could do it. Sounds like that was a would too, doesn't it? And businesses claiming to be too big to fail could be bailed out by the government if they started to go bankrupt. So that's what happens. They can, that happened here, 2008. So one wonders if China had to become communist to be saved by capitalism, with Chinese characteristics, because Chinese capitalism experiment was proof positive. It had the ability to raise living standards, even in some rural areas. Yet China was always a collective society. So capitalist individualism was never a serious concept in their group culture. But private capitalism surged even in the countryside, especially in the countryside where there was nothing else going, where small businesses soon were a significant part of China. Barbers were making more money than heart surgeons when they first changed over in that new economy. So in the past, warlords had fiefdoms in different parts of the country, when when not controlled by strong dynastic leaders. In fact, the local level was where most of the corruption took place, even until recently. So China was always a big country, and as long as tax remittances came into the capital, they left the provinces alone, as long as the money was coming in for tax money. Okay, so this is a chart to show the flow of money in a mixed economy. So you basically have things going to firms and you have things going to households. It does both. And there's physical and monetary flow back to the government, you see, on both sides. So let's talk about shareholder versus stakeholder. It's important to know the distinction here. So shareholder versus stakeholder, important difference between capitalism's models. Okay, the main difference is shareholders are usually interested for the short term only, whereas stakeholders are invested or maintain a long-term relationship to the firm. And also your relationship in the business depends on which one you are. For instance, shareholders are generally considered as the best way to spread the rent, to spread the income made, the return on investment. They're interested in that mainly in the primary goal. Okay, so short-term investors can succeed with good return on income as their primary goal. Generally, they are investing using money just to make money. Liquidity, dividends, share value focus are a prime concern for shareholders. They will sacrifice the company for different profits if the numbers are high enough. A Duke University 2006 economic study revealed 78% of public company CEOs would sacrifice long-term economic value for a short-term price lift. So stakeholders are generally a person with a long-term vested interest in the company. Long-term goal is firm sustainability. So strategy for rising growth and prosperity, they have a reliance on the firm for the future success of the community, the customer, the employees, supplier. So they have there's two different versions. Okay, so let's go further afield. Okay, so there's one important connotation here. All shareholders are stakeholders. You see that dark circle in there. Those are the shareholders that own stock. But not all stakeholders are shareholders. So it's just an easy way to remember something. And then you have here over on the side, when you're a shareholder, you have a seat at the table, and it all depends on how much of the company you own. And these people here that are sitting there, they own various amounts of the company. And then again, it talks about this large circle is a stakeholder. There's more stakeholders in there than shareholders, but all those shareholders are also stakeholders now. Okay. Okay, so this is a little bit more about stakeholder theory, but the only important thing here to look at is that they divide it in two key categories of stakeholders, internal and external. So you've got three internal stakeholders, employees, managers, and owners, and then six external stakeholders, suppliers, society, government, creditors, shareholders, and customers. Okay, so let's go on to another. These are unusual diagrams here, so let's take a look at these. These here are the Doughnut diagrams. Doughnut model charts get wide use today, showing connectivity of each section to others. They have become a part of the discussion in sustainability and stakeholder theory. Oxford economist Kate Raworth is a stroke of genius, utilized them in her 2017 best-selling book, Doughnut Economics: 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist. A new tool reframes an old problem, embedding the Earth's systems and our societies into Doughnut charts, revealing how economic flow ties in all together responsibly, as we are more than just workers, consumers, and owners of capital. The Doughnut chart visually quickly reaches new levels of relevance in sustainable economic discussions, showing that intersection of environment, economy, and society and government. All of those, you see this one off to your right, all of them are in there. And let me give you a little more information on that. So let's look. The Doughnut chart is a visual quick read for new levels of relevance here in sustaining economic discussions. So the rings, there are 2 rings in there. One is with the ecological ceiling, and the other one is a social foundation. And those 2 form the Doughnut. And any activity or any space that you spend within those 2, you're in the right place. You're not an imposition to the environment. You're not an imposition to the economy. So it's a new tool that reframes an old problem, embedding the Earth's systems of the systems in our societies into Doughnut charts, revealing economic flow ties. So the Doughnut chart visual quickly reached new levels of relevance in sustainable economic discussions, showing the intersection of environment, economy, society, and government relations. Now the rings, you see, they form a Doughnut space between them. And that's an inclusion zone to be safe and just space for humanity. So, and there's another one. Classes have been covered on this material in Henry George School to understand more about it. So these concepts from Kate Raworth, they may be doing another class on them soon. So keep your eye out for that if they do, and you can learn more about it. It's a much greater degree than I just did now. So perhaps they will be offered again. And then this one on the left side, you see those orange markings. Those are areas of stress where the people and the planet are not in sync because they're out there in areas of stress. Okay. Okay, so now we're going to talk about Schumpeter. This is a bit more heady, but I hope you enjoy it, because you certainly had a lot of penetrating insights. And I'm just going to read from his book. See, this one book here, Can Capitalism Survive? He predicted, look up in the turquoise section there, you see, can capitalism survive? No, I don't think it can. Creative destruction and the future of the global economy. And then he says also the essential point is to grasp that you're dealing with capitalism, you're dealing with evolutionary process. It's never going to be standing still. So let me read on about that some things here. Okay. Doughnut model charts got used. We read that already. So Joseph Schumpeter, Austrian economist. Unlike most economists, Schumpeter had a tragic life. He was 4 when his father died, and then frequently in exile, moved his household 23 times in his life, residing in 5 different countries, rewriting himself often. After failing as a lawyer, he was president of a private Viennese bank, but was dismissed from there. Then 7 months later, he was a new Austrian Republic finance minister, and he was a professor in Austria, the finance minister, and finally Harvard in 1932, he got a job there. His beloved mother, so in other words, tragedy struck in 1926, his second wife, Anna, died in childbirth along with a child. His beloved mother died later the same year. Even at 42, he never fully recovered from this triple shock. After the Great Depression came, was followed by another deadly war, and he had predicted in 1928, and that's when he moved to America to teach at Harvard. So now, 70 years later, penetrating insights in his writings and history and current events all confirm him as being one of the greatest economists and intellects of the 20th century. So instead, his entrepreneurial innovation, experimentation constantly destroy the old and introduce new equilibria, making possible higher standards of living. His arguments defied tradition. Markets don't passively reach equilibrium until margins are wiped out. So in other words, you'd have to, everyone was trying to find equilibrium at the turn of the century, but not him. He just said it didn't happen. He says, seldom are they in equilibrium. And he proved that they weren't. So, can capitalism survive? No, I don't think so. There were foreboding opening words in Schumpeter's book, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. Schumpeter claimed that capitalism's success would be the cause of its failure. And in his own words said, there were foreboding, I felt it my duty to take and to inflict upon the reader considerable trouble in order to head up a runaway here, in order to head up effectively to my paradoxical conclusion. Capitalism is being killed by its own achievements. In other words, it was so successful that people didn't believe in it anymore. That's what he said. I mean, there's a little bit of that happening now out there. So being first to claim capitalism's decline and fall would be due to its own success. He rested entirely on the key reason being his theory of creative destruction, of which the future of capitalism depends. So this quote, he says, the essential point to grasp is that in dealing with capitalism, we are dealing with an evolutionary process. So capitalism then is by nature a form of method or economic change, and not only never is, but never can be stationary. The fundamental impulse that sets and keeps the capitalist engine in motion comes from the stationary. The fundamental impulse that's that new consumer goods comes from new consumer goods, new methods, new production or transportation, new markets, All of these play into the capitalist enterprise, where they basically they're incessantly revolutionizing the economic structure from within, incessantly destroying the old one, incessantly creating a new one. The process of creative destruction is the essential fact about capitalism. Here as well. So capitalism cannot survive, for the creative entrepreneur will progressively be replaced by bureaucratic managers. So capital revolutionizes and rationalizes everything in its path, especially obsolete social institutions, which are evicted from the economic scene by the perennial gale of creative destruction. Entrepreneurs are men of genius, seeing beyond the routine to pioneer new methods of production to drive change. Capitalism's survival depends on the initiative of entrepreneurs. So capitalism survive. Entrepreneurs lead the productive process into ever new and revolutionary directions. Schumpeter argues technological progress will eventually strangle entrepreneurial function, and the process of incessant change will grind to a halt, spelling the end of capitalism. Social foundations of capitalism, such as voluntary exchange and private property, are defining capitalism of a capitalist society that will illuminate when other forms of capitalism organization attain dominance. Schumpeter argues that through continued economic development this occurs. So as entrepreneurs innovate, they reap economic rewards. Production then expands and new forms of capitalist organization emerge as modern firms looking to capture economic opportunities. As firm size increases, so does its bureaucracy. The functions of ownership and control gradually separate. Eventually, the owners find their connection to and acknowledge of the capitalist process has been severed. Okay, so Schumpeter said bureaucracy is not an obstacle to democracy, but an inevitable complement to it. Eventually, the owners find their connection to and knowledge of the economic process is severed, and they lose it. Isolated economic reality, sympathy for capitalism wanes, along with social support for institutions that form the foundation of capitalism. These render the capitalist system open to attack from hostile parties. So Joseph Schumpeter, he then goes on to talk about how it's changing. And the public mind has by now so thoroughly grown out of humor with it as to make condemnation of capitalism and all its works a foregone conclusion, also a requirement of the etiquette of discussion. So can capitalism survive? I have tried to show that a socialist form of society will inevitably emerge from an equally inevitable decomposition of capitalist society. Writings on sociology of the intellectual so further explain capitalism's dilemma. So by definition, they essentially have no direct experience in economic affairs. These are the intellectuals. They wield decisive power in influencing public opinion, and their bias is strongly anti-capitalism. They represent a very real threat to the capitalist system. And it's mostly the intellectuals that Schumpeter makes with his famous remark. Capitalism provides the means that intellectuals require to attack it. Innovation to make disseminating opinion both possible and extremely expensive. Education delivered to enough of the population to provide an audience big enough to influence lasting social changes and necessary for public criticism of good institutions. So his insights and sociological characteristics of this whole class was very interesting. So let's get on down further here to capitalism. Inevitably, by virtue of the very logic of its civilization, creates education and subsidizes a vested interest in social unrest. There are daily troubles and expectations of trouble beyond everyone encounters in any social system. Frictions and disappointments, greater and smaller unpleasant events to hurt, annoy, and thwart. And I suppose every one of us is more or less in the habit of attributing this wholly to that part of reality which lies outside of us, our own skin. The emotional attachment to the social order is the very thing capitalism is constantly unable to produce. It's necessary to turn to overcome hostile impulses, which we react to. Secular improvement. Here, let's go to the next one here. So secular improvement, when it's taken for granted and coupled with individual insecurity, that's actually resented and is, of course, the best recipe for breeding social unrest. So these are basically all these other quotes here where he's talking about, he sees it as becoming socialist. So let's talk about creative destruction. So creative destruction, this is ongoing. And this is where it gets more interesting here. So creative destruction, disruptive technology. At the heart of capitalism is creative destruction. Creative destruction is essential fact about capitalism. Economic progress in capitalism society means turmoil. So capitalism has the markings of creative destruction all over it. Schumpeter is clear about this in all three of the short quotes, which I just read to you. Creative destruction is a never-ending, incessant product and process innovation mechanism by which new products replace outdated ones, where the old is being steadily replaced by the new. It's the essential fact about capitalism and Schumpeter's unique insight to explain how economies grow. Economies progress. Economic progress is not gradual or peaceful, but often disjointed and sometimes unpleasant. Old assumptions need to be made room for innovations, providing greater benefit to the existing business environment. This situation is further explained by another quote. I'll read it now. Situations emerge in the progress of creative destruction where many firms may have to perish that nevertheless would live on vigorously and usefully if they could weather a particular storm. Abundant recent evidence supports the Schumpeterian view that the process of creative destruction is a significant phenomenon at the core of economic growth in market economies. So there's some different examples here of technologies that were brought, up against the gales of creative destruction. So the horse and carriage succumbs to the automobile. This is one of the greatest examples of creative destruction in our time. Henry Ford didn't invent the automobile, but he used the invention to introduce a new manufacturing process, the moving assembly line, that changed the whole industrial world. Consumers and laborers benefit from a resulting 2% increase in 1923 GDP of an increased car sales from 64,000 in 1908 to 3.6 million in 1923, which resulted in Ford employing hundreds of thousands of workers in this factory. Okay, so this manufacturing, we get a glimpse also of Fordism an earlier American stakeholder version, creating America's middle class. Now, Ford was a genius entrepreneur with an invention and a new process to produce it. Schumpeter says it's this kind of competition that counts. The new commodity, the new technology, and the new supply, source of supply, the new type of organization, which strikes not at the margins of profit and the outputs of existing firms, but at the very foundations of their very lives. So, it changed so much. In other words, the 2% increase in GDP from 1923, that was just from other products that were made with that moving parts line. So also, the container cargo ship was another great example of creative destruction. The 1956 invention of cargo containers made globalization possible. It took decades for ports to rebuild for it. Malcolm McLean, a retired truck driver, was the genius behind the invention and the process. And then another one, of course, is the change from computers to typewriters, analog to digital. And it was ushered in the digital revolution. And then off to the right, out to the far left, we see the Kodak moment. It was a lost moment. In other words, Kodak waited much too long to get into the digital camera business. They waited way too long. And then they fell apart. I mean, their business basically was developing film. So they didn't want the digital camera to succeed because it wasn't going to use film. So they tried to keep the analog as alive as possible. And you can see in the chart when you're looking at it, how it goes down. And then still the digital camera is a huge mountain behind the analog, but it doesn't matter. Okay, that's pretty much it then. Let me just finish it off with innovation and entrepreneurship. So Joseph Schumpeter, creative destruction affecting the S&P 500 stock index. Let's look at that here. Now the S&P 500, what happened is that you see the amount of years that a stock would stay on that. The company turnover rate in the S&P 500, Standard & Poor's 500, accelerated every decade since 1920. In 1920, the average company tenure on S&P 500 was around 65 years. By the 1990s, it was down to 10 years. Even the best corporations can't sustain market-beating performance levels more than 10 to 15 years. So creative destruction acceleration will extend into the next 2 decades. Corporations are built and started by the assumption of continuity, focused on operation and creation. Whereas capital markets are built on discontinuity, focus on creation and destruction. So companies might become more open to new ideas and adjust to changing speeds of the market. The rate of scale and change in the market is likely to accelerate over the next 20 years. So pressure will be intense to compete in new ways, since playing it safe may be even worse. Yeah, so anyways, now let's go to the next one. This is the last one, last slide. Oh no, next to last, sorry. So this is again for innovation and entrepreneurship. And Schumpeter saw innovation and entrepreneurship as the 2 most important drivers of capitalist growth. Innovation is the market introduction of a technical or organizational novelty, not just an invention. The strategic stimulus to economic development in Schumpeter's analysis is innovation, defined as the commercial or industrial application of something new, a new product, process or a method of production, a new market or a source of supply or a new form of commercial, business, or financial organization. So innovation is the form of creative destruction, is a driving force. Not only of capitalism, but of material growth, progress in general. Innovations are changes which cannot be decomposed into infinitesimal steps. Surely nothing can be more so the proposition that innovation is at the center of practically all phenomena, difficulties, and problems of economic life and in capitalist society. So let's look at these. Let me see. At these two graphs here. And basically there's a quick take home here. Let's see if I have that. So the alternative, two sectors are in turmoil of innovation and entrepreneurship. How will they continue? The alternative energy initiative risks being a new Kodak moment for the US energy sector. In other words, they're holding back getting into it. So the clean energy business gets closer, but may still be far away from a tipping point. So putting it into a favorable phase for more rapid cost-cutting business sector development, making it a core technology prospect of a more entrepreneurial attention and increased R&D spending, it's research and development. So it has become close to $1 a watt baseline cost. So you see that baseline where those three, the blue, the green, and the red, they sort of end up close to the baseline there. So that's a baseline price that they've been shooting for. It's come close to 1,000 watt baseline cost level that once reached for alternative energy. Many oil importing developing companies have a sense of urgency and are beginning everything to gain and nothing to lose. So in terms of finding a solution to their energy conundrum, to save and make them billions if they can. So innovations at the top, not impossible. Apple did it, but you have this. So you see the graph with Apple there. Let me see if I can get it. No, it's not helping me. So anyways, what I wanted to do is I wanted to just get this graph here and zoom this up here. So you can see, let me see, I'll put it here. Anyways, Apple came out with a vengeance when they put all those new products there. In other words, Apple settled into an incumbent style leadership model in the mid 90s, when successive professional managers focused on customer retention and incremental change were dismissed after years of stock price stagnation, because they focused on retention and incremental. They didn't want that. So this calls for changes, and Apple did what amounted to an innovation blitz from co-founders Jobs and Wozniak in 2002. The iPod, then the iTunes, the iPhone, the iPad were in successive winning products that built up the brand name to previously unknown heights with the rapid succession of new technology items. Each new product steepened the adoption curve, showed each was being accepted more quickly than the other. So their customers could not get enough of their products, and Apple became the first US firm to reach $1 trillion in August 2018, and then to reach another $2 trillion market cap in August 2020. So that was quite an accomplishment. So this is probably the more interesting one, this slide coming up. And you can see these are waves of innovation. At the bottom here, you had water power, textiles, commerce, then you had steam power and the second wave. Third wave, electricity, chemicals, internal combustion engine. Fourth wave, petrochemicals, electric, aviation, space. Fifth wave, and then on and on, sixth wave as well. So this is
Looks like we lost Michael. Let me find out.
It's close to the end anyway, so maybe until Michael comes back, maybe we can start comments.
Michael had a little issue with his connection, but he's coming back. In the meantime, I think we can start taking questions. We are already 4 minutes above the allocated time, but I guess around 10-minute Q&A wouldn't be a bad idea because I've seen a lot of activity on the chat. You want to start, Yanis?
I will wait for Michael because I had some point of information kind of questions. But so if anybody else has any comments.
Okay. I don't see anybody raising their hands. Jonah, are you ready?
Yeah, I guess I was a little curious. This is a relatively small question, but I was curious about the differences between the cost of offshore wind power in the United States versus Denmark. If that's just a economies of scale issue, or if there's something about their climate comparative to ours.
That's a very specific question. Some research need to be really done, or someone has to have it available. I really don't know. How is the gap? How is the difference? Is it a big one?
It seemed relatively. The two things that I was interested in was both it seems that it was cheaper in Denmark overall, but also that the changes for Denmark comparative to the United States weren't sort of linear, like they weren't like directionally proportionate across the board. They seemed to be like jumping down at different points on the time scale in the different two countries. That just sort of interested me.
Okay. Well, pricing strategy probably, or how open the market is. You know, how many suppliers are there in Denmark and how many are there here? That can all be come to play to explain the difference in pricing. I guess Michael could have more details on that. Let me see if he's in.
Also Denmark could have maybe a bigger participation of like government investment, which maybe was not true in the US at that time. I don't think it's even true today. So, you know.
You mean the government subsidizing the cost?
Or providing seed capital, for example, which is important for for the operating margins of these companies. It may reduce their financing costs, and that way making it like less expensive to deploy and develop
Okay.
these these technologies.
That makes sense. Any other comments or questions?
Faizan seemed to have one in the chat.
Faizan. Okay, Faizan, go ahead. You can unmute yourself.
Their microphone seems not to be working, but I can read it.
Go ahead.
Showed an average wage versus productivity graph. The picture could be different if we focus a little deeper on individual sectors. Is there any individual sector responsible for this primarily?
Well, the divergence between wages and GDP, is that what he's talking about?
Productivity.
Productivity. Well, I think what it means is the productivity is not benefiting the working class. There is also, I've seen this graph in many instances, but there is also another layer that I've seen that is added to it. They show that the decrease in wages went along with, how do I call it? The decrease in wage basically went along with an increase in what you would call profit. Profit being a term that is very controversial because some of it is actually rent. But at the same time, you can also see another graph. There is another graph that they put on top of it. I don't remember which institute did the research, but they also saw that there was an increase in the amount of money that is being given to the working class in terms of loans. So the GDP has increased, but the distribution is really where the problem is. So there is definitely a relationship. Whatever the workers are not getting, somebody else is getting it. You can even argue to the point where you say, if you do a time series analysis, you will see that all this started happening at the time where unions were being busted. So which means less bargaining power for the working class. So more of it is being distributed to the upper echelons of society. So there's definitely a correlation there.
I mean, managerial base. So it's not that all labor. I think depends which laborers. I think Faizan's question makes a very good point. That if you look, for example, the financial sector and whatever the financial sector defines as productivity, that probably must have shot up. But then if you make an aggregate, I think you should see the sectoral changes because there must be winners and losers within the labor sector as well, but as well as between the different sectors of the economy.
Yeah.
So CEOs, for example, they made, they make like hundreds of multiples now compared to the average worker. That was not the case when that divergence started happening. So it's not that labor doesn't get an increased share, it's which laborers, the managerial ones, the managerial laborers get a lot more than, for example, the blue collar or the,
yeah. Overall, I think it would a better characterization would be the middle class, because the middle class usually would not include the top guys that you are talking about right now. Tom Rossman.
Yes, hi guys. So my observations are more along the lines of really starting from the beginning and looking at Adam Smith. Adam Smith wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which begins with, no matter how selfish a person is assumed to be, there is something within every person that lends their desire to see other people succeed, even if it's just for the benefit of observing it. And in fact, the Germans for 50 years had a debate about the theory of moral sentiments and the wealth of nations, and trying to reconcile what they viewed as two different ideas. And they called it the Das Adam Smith problem. which is kind of funny. But the interesting thing is that a lot of I think there's a really big mischaracterization of capitalism. And, as you know, Ibrahim, we're in the process of developing a new model for society. And one of the principal issues is that, Denmark and Sweden have extremely free economies. They're rated higher than the United States. If you look at the Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative think tank, or you can't see me, but I'm putting think in quotes. And so what they actually do is they have a bigger welfare state. So some of the things, a very good example of this is childcare. They have a very robust, Sweden especially, and Denmark as well, have a very robust childcare system. And they voluntarily, as a society, have decided that they're going to give more money to the government, and their government actually uses that money quite efficiently in delivering very high quality childcare, which in turn allows, and this is a traditional thing, but it's a fact of life, that it frees up women to be more active in their economy,
Workplace.
and that has raised the productivity of their economy quite tremendously.
Yep.
So a lot of this stuff is misunderstood because it's viewed as being this sort of, we view it on this left-right paradigm, which is a very narrow, one-dimensional, linear interpretation, when in fact it's a lot more complex than that. And Germany is a very free economy, but they are willing to give a much higher percentage of their income across the board. By the way, these are far less progressive tax systems than what we have. Ours is much more graduated, and as a result, they get much more robust services from the government. I mean, obviously, the other huge example is healthcare. So I think, if we really look at what Adam Smith was trying to do, he was trying to paint a picture of how society can flourish. And I think we've understood that when America flourished in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and early 70s, it was a society that was much more united, much more willing because of the progressive era and the New Deal, and the perception that Roosevelt did so much to save the country domestically and internationally, but primarily domestically. And so they were willing to give the government a much more leniency, this notion of taxation, right? So in the 1960s, when the economy was growing at 3 to 4% per year, we had much higher productivity, and we had 70% tax on the highest earners. So a lot of these arguments get confused because we mix the political left-right spectrum with the actual functioning of the economy, and really what in economic terms is called the welfare state, which is much bigger in Scandinavia, much bigger in the Germanic countries, and much bigger in every other developed country, because they handle some form of universal health care. So I think,
but Tom, but you're making the same mistake to call the same social welfare in the US is not the same as the social welfare in Sweden. The incentives are different, and for example, the unemployment system is different in Germany as well. So we incentivize, people to take time off and not do anything, but they incentivize to people to get back into the productive sector. So, and the same thing with childcare as well. So if the government, and also Scandinavian countries, and especially Sweden, has done many mistakes with overrelying on government and government mishandling the social welfare programs and creative.
I'm not making a value judgment.
No.
I'm not making a value judgment on whether it's good or bad. I'm just explaining that I think it's widely misunderstood and mischaracterized, and these countries have extremely free economies. To open a business, to run a business is very open and not difficult at all. But at the same time, they have a different view on the role of government in their society.
Yeah, I mean, if government is just another private corporation. I mean, as long as we keep We keep thinking that government is like some different entity. No, it's made of private individuals who have their own interests. And
Well,
wherever
but
these
government is
individuals, hold on,
government
whenever
is
these
the way that we
individuals,
government is
whenever
the way
these
that we
individuals have,
yes government is the way that we implement the social contract. So
social
government is the
contract,
way
but
that
what
we
does
set
that
up the
mean?
rules.
What
So
does
it's
that
not a
mean?
private corporation. It's the
Yeah,
government is the collective representative of the people.
Government is the enabler of crony capitalism that Michael was talking about. Because the government is a big contractor that all these crony capitalists they're feasting on. So it depends how government works. Government is not just something, it's
Yes,
an agglomeration of private
completely,
individuals. It's a private company.
Well, I don't agree with that, but I agree with your point that,
It is.
I think this
government is the
Who is
way
the
that we make
government?
things work.
Is the government made from individuals?
going back and forth on, but I just
all right. Yeah, Yanis, it looks like Jonah has a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, my question for Michael was, in terms of when you're defining the means of production, I guess I came in 5 minutes late, so I may have missed it, but I was just curious if you could define that for me.
Michael is not here.
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, you are back. Good. I didn't even notice. Go ahead.
Yeah, it was quiet. That's why. Okay. Anyways, well, thank you for asking that question. But as far as production goes, like for instance, when Ford introduced the automobile, it wasn't his invention, but he introduced that moving assembly line that changed everything. You know, I mean, it brought a lot of prosperity. In other words, the amount of labor that people would put in to make us to give value to something was much less, and we see that with computers as well. And so what happens is what Schumpeter seems to say a lot of times is that the entrepreneur is far more valuable if he brings a new manufacturing process or a new type of process to make something, because that's where the money is made. Because you know, most manufacturers, everybody needs manufacturers, you know, and once the factories close down, they don't start up again too easy. So that was just that point with Ford. And if you read more about Ford, it gets more interesting there, because Ford.
Michael, his question is about the means of production. What do you mean by the means of production?
The means of productions. Yeah. So you know, the factory. You know, if you're the land, the factory, the machinery.
So
you know, anything that will contribute to making it a higher productive rate. You know, it can be a piece, you know, a piece of machinery, a factory, anything like that. Even a system, you know, if like the movable assembly build. I know. Does that make sense to you, or is that not what you were thinking about?
It makes a lot of sense. So I think that my sort of confusion, I think, lies in sort of you're describing. What I hear there is essentially infrastructure as one piece of that, and that's I think the primary thing that you're
correct. Yeah.
But I'm also hearing land sort of as described as part of that, and I'm just sort of curious because. I mean, in terms of my background in the Georgia sort of world, I've thought of those as being sort of separate components. I'm just sort of curious.
Well, I think Henry George makes it a separate component, but you know you can't do any production without having land. You know, you need the land. So the land is probably the most important thing. And
interesting. So you're defining that as part of the means of production.
Yeah. In other words, where you know you're going to have to, if you're going to produce something somewhere, you'll need land. You know, you'll need a building on the land or something like that. You can't do a virtual. You do a virtual production.
It would be a factor of production. I don't know if you would call it a means of production. Henry George defines that as a factor of production.
Right.
You know.
Yeah, it's kind of confusing, especially in George's thought, to talk about means of production and throw land in there.
It is a means of production. It's non-man-made, though. That's the difference. Capital, like machinery, is a means of production, but that's man-made.
Yeah.
So there is man-made means of production, non-man-made means of production. The non-man-made means of production is what George at least, and I think it's correct to see it that way, is what we call land. It's not just land in the real estate or agricultural term. Anything, any force of nature, gravity is land.
Yeah.
The electromagnetic spectrum is land. It's non-man-made. It's a means of production. Telecommunications companies use it, okay, but they didn't make it. So I don't know, Jonah, if that's kind of clarifies the non-man-made aspect and the man-made aspect.
Well, when a lot of these Eastern European states, like, if you even had a mimeograph machine, you would have to register because you could produce like paper and, propaganda. That was a means of production. Even a little mimeograph machine where you roll it, and those things, they were so messy with the ink and everything. I remember in those days when I used one in the 60s, it was awful.
All right. So it's 8:22. I guess we can just close it here. And Michael, what would be the next session? That's next week, right? Next Monday.
Correct. Yeah. Well, the Anglo-American model.
Okay. So you're gonna go through the different models, Anglo-American, and then you'll have the
German, then Swedish,
okay.
then Chinese.
Very good. That's what I thought. Great. So it was really nice to have you all here, and thanks for your patience with all these little technology glitches. And we'll do better next time. And I hope to see you next week.
Yeah. Thank you very much also, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.